Thanks, Pat. Welcome back to New Gravity, everybody, and welcome to this session. I'm Bomi Jung, and I've been fighting climate change for nearly 20 years, 14 of them in the affordable housing sector, first at Enterprise, and most recently at the New York City Housing Authority, which is the nation's largest rental housing owner, and a national leader in sustainability that is committed to decarbonize by 2050. When I left in the April of this year, the many projects underway included passive house retrofit pilots and a 10,000 plus unit heating and hot water electrification program. But what's really stayed with me the most from my time at NYCHA is the myriad of ways in which, as Dr. Daniels pointed out last night, we've been failing as a society to orient ourselves towards the creation of the beloved community. So I think that all of us in affordable housing, serving some of the most vulnerable people in our cities, understand that we need to do more, but it's honestly really hard to get projects done within the system we have, and taking time to struggle with the systemic limits is a lot to take on. So it's with particular pleasure that I introduce two women, and I'm honored to call them my friends as well as colleagues, who have wrestled in their professional practice with how to put their personal commitment to equity and climate justice literally on the ground as built projects. Ifeoma is an urban planner, urban designer, and strategist. She's led multidisciplinary initiatives funded by the UN, FIFA, and the New York City Mayor's Office in planning and implementation of projects supporting racial, social, and cultural equity. She currently leads urban design and pre-development initiatives at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And as the founding director of Creative Urban Alchemy, she consults on equitable urban design and sustainable development strategy for city governments and civic institutions internationally. Satpal Kaur is a designer and building system thought leader who has applied her passion for data and building science to implementing cutting-edge technologies in buildings, serving diverse clients for more than a decade, a firm believer in holistically integrating clients as active partners in pursuing comfortable and healthy living environments. She worked with Chris Benedict to design the first multifamily passive houses in New York City. And Satpal was recognized in 2018 with a 40 Under 40 award by Building Design and Construction. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Satpal for the first presentation.
Thank you, Bomi. All right, so you guys see my screen. All right, let's start. Hi, everyone. My name is Satpal. It's my pleasure to be here as part of this amazing panel alongside Bomi and Ifeoma. Today, I will be self-examining my own practice, speaking about the beauty of justice, the poetics of space, and aesthetics. So let's begin. As the evolution of buildings have developed, the comfort threshold has decreased with the introduction of construction technologies, and the energy usage has increased to serve the demand. Residential and commercial buildings account for roughly 29% of the total US greenhouse gas emissions. That's a problem. We know this is a problem. In recognizing the need to reduce energy, there has been great innovation work done by many of you in this room by creating a homeostasis of comfort and energy that follows building science principles by continuous super insulation on the enclosure and air tightness, thermally broken windows, no thermal bridges, continuous ventilations through an ERV. These improvements, just by designing these energy efficient buildings, have led to emissions reductions in the residential and commercial sectors of 17 to 11% respectively since the 2005 peak. Even in the grand global pandemic, where we have been experimenting and adjusting to the new normal, we have proven that we can have an impact on our carbon footprint, where 2.6 billions of carbon dioxide were not emitted to the atmosphere. Climate change is here. We know it's here. It affects air, water, everyone. It's interconnected, especially the vulnerable. So who are the vulnerable community? Well, you have children, the elderly, low-income communities. What are the conditions that make these communities vulnerable? I will be using New York City in the following slides to understand this better. I'll start with the policies. The way policies and metropolitan regions are designed and planned following practices and policies does not give everyone equal access to living conditions that are fair, affordable, and accessible and clean. These policies result in creating environmental sacrifice zones, that vulnerable communities are subject to purely because they live there. Example of this is the racist housing redlining laws of the mid-20th century used by the Federal Housing Administration to insure mortgages. The following colors were used. Green was used because it was the best area because mostly white people lived there. Blue was used because still seen as still desirable because it still has some white people there. And yellow was seen as the areas as definitely declining with the transition of minorities moving in. And the red area was seen as hazardous just because it had Black people, therefore likelihood of them getting mortgages was much less. This resulted to longtime New Yorkers not having the same opportunity to home ownership. This also resulted to security and wealth accrual is not there as they're being dispatched from the neighborhoods that were once deemed as being undesirable that are now desirable. As we continue this mapping exercise, even using the significant maritime and industrial areas, the SMIAs in New York City, we see that they're located along the coastal periphery itself. And most of them actually fall into the classic environmental justice communities that are predominantly low-income communities in the South Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. This also happens to be the area that people of color live, where 66% of the people of color are actually the darker purple areas that you can see. The land use map shows that the industrial manufacturing areas are also concentrated in the SMIA areas over here, which are the dark purple and the reds, which are then surrounded by the yellow areas, which are the residential. Poverty is actually below poverty line. Census tracts with dark red denotes areas where more than 66% of the community is below poverty level. They're vulnerable to storm surges and live half a mile from the SMIAs. Many low-income households live in or live half a mile from approximately from the SMIAs as well. So again, the darker greens. Data from New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, we can see the SMIAs and the adjacent areas include some of the highest levels of uninsured people by community district, which are the dark blue colors, again falling under the SMIAs, which donates limited access to health insurance in the event of a toxic exposure. As sea level rises, these communities will further be threatened and endangered by the stored toxic waste in the neighborhood. And in the event of the storm surge, the facilities handling the hazardous substance or toxic chemicals will threaten these communities even more. The impact of climate change is connected even to the financial energy burden and stresses for these communities who are just making it, just paycheck by paycheck. Even when you just use the example of extremely low income New Yorker who's making for a full family $32,220 and the rent is of $631, the childcare annually is $16,000 approximately, they still happen to be uninsured. And when you do the math and you just break everything out, the living cost and what they have in order to even save is not even enough. You have totally approximately about $141. And this is where 6% of their income, as mentioned yesterday by the keynote, is mostly going towards the electric bill itself. For me, I see a pattern emerging. Architecture, planning, health, transportation, land use, food security, finance, climate resilience, this is all interconnected. The response to climate change cannot be done alone. It is collective, interdisciplinary, experimental partnership leading to the policy change we believe and need to disrupt, whether it might be architecture meeting health and insurance or architecture meeting planning and finance. So then I pose the question to myself and to the rest of you. As a high performance design community, who are we designing for? Is it the NGOs, the not-for-profit, the citizens investing in sustainable lifestyle, universities, or the developers? I actually see this as a very small subset group that has the resources and the wherewithals to influence design needs and demands. This innovation that we are part of as a group, why is it inaccessible and not exclusive to the broader community? Well, pardon my pun, there's some thermal bridging happening here. The sizable population that happens to be vulnerable doesn't have an equal partnership at the table, which means the privileges are different to those who are choosing a high-performing lifestyle, to those who simply do not even know the option exists. This gets translated in the low-income guidelines that are not equitable from the unit sizes and the square footage shrinking. Are we missing the opportunity to understand the current four-family person, to cross-generation living, to different cultures in light of the pandemic where we are all at home? Buildings are not a tick box, and neither are the people living there. In designing the high-performing buildings, I find myself even more questioning my own implicit biases and status quo to design. Where can I use my privilege to ask the uncomfortable questions that my younger self would never have done? To break away from the stereotypes of my own colonial background upbringing. For example, does a public building need to be brick and standardized windows? Does glass curtain wall equals the modern and wealthy life? It is this vulnerability that I feel at times begins to connect us all, where there is natural disasters, which then become a form of neutral ground for us to actually start talking. And this is where we actually realize these are the very vulnerable communities that are actually at risk. If they are not protected, none of us are. And it actually allows us a place to come together and start future-proofing together. One of the examples that I really like about this is a response to Hurricane Harvey in Houston, where they formed the Coalition for Environmental Equity and Resilience. Here, many groups who are both based on the east and west side, this was a response to them where they realized this very fact that regardless of your skin color, regardless of your socio-economical status, you're going to be impacted if we're not really thinking about that very vulnerable community and the climate change as a response of it. So in designing 8-3 Knickerbocker with Chris Benedict, it integrated the passive house principles with designs using the modeling tools to shade and creating a design that be aesthetically pleasing and not be labeled as affordable housing. To me, this was important. To me, it was also amazing to see the interest that this building generated and the pride that the community who were living in this actually began to feel, as well as them adapting to the passive house interiors that were absent from the noise and steam radiated banks. Even with this, the response in design is critical. So even as you start looking at it deeper, my perspective has been becoming more holistic over the years. And this is an example that I did recently, and it was the Marlborough campus where it was a retrofit project. The building campus itself is located in a flood zone. It was decided that the building would not be demolished, but instead retrofitted, keeping the tenants in place as this was still their home. It was less disruptive, and the work will be done all in one, and it will be all externally. So as we started to analyze the site itself, it was important, at least to me and the landscape architect, that we start activating these corners by the first floor and generally out to the neighborhood itself. The facade retrofit would be different for each building. The buildings facing the subway over here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, due to the pollution and the noise, it would be best to actually understand the indoor air quality first by creating data loggers and understand what the community needs and wants are as we go further. Each building condition will be addressed individually to fully diagnose it. Even the retrofit approaches will be different. The surface volume is different for each enclosure, therefore different loads, which you can see with type 1 and type 2. Early resilient design data logging for existing conditions was critical in order to understand what the inside environment was also doing. And also early planning for this type of building was essential, so we don't actually repeat the mistakes just because we're on site. So the construction planning, the HVAC, prefab enclosure, building energy analysis, all to be done beforehand before we actually run to designing everything. And then from that, break down the series of levels and phases which actually begins to respond to each of these buildings. With one of the number one things that we had outlined was plan work at the basement level for new sewer systems, and coordinate this with the landscaping, so tenants can see the results and the building operates efficiently and is prepared for future disasters. Different installation techniques, where obviously if you have balconies, it will have more thermal bridges, so you would actually be responding to that different. The HVAC system, aligning it so it actually becomes part of the design. Future proofing to incorporate for future solar installation if required. The design intent is to be complementary to the comfort of the user. And I think that's why it's essential not to have a process where we're just going to do all the roof sourced or we're going to just do all the facades. But every building is different and everyone who lives in that building is different. Design can be transformative in a large scale, but it can also be transformative in a small scale. The window AC prototype that I did for the Bronx Po developers was one that actually proved that to me. It was the first time they were doing something like this for the passive house, and it had to meet a lot of requirements. You had to meet the passive house requirements for loads for summer and winter, where the actual unit could be closed, where the bottom portion could be closed in the winter, so it could actually not drive up the energy loads. And in summer, you can actually operate and use the air conditioner itself. This also had to be ADA compliant and meet the whole light and air per code. So it had to be universal for all. This was to me more than an object. The success of this led to Bronx Po choosing to pay for the cooling and heating bills, since the bills were so low and the cost was being covered by the solar panels. He also showed me the flexibility of the window AC in the new and retrofit design moving forward. But what it really showed me was how even relationship in building management and community can be formed on trust, and how even a portfolio can be changed. To me, climate change equation is not just only climate change following a European energy formula. It's also about integrating and recognizing environmental justice in the practice and design holistically from the beginning. So I pose the question back to you. So who are we designing for? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Satpal. So we're going to go right to Ifeoma's presentation, and I will like to just also remind attendees that you can go ahead and put in any questions that you'd like to see addressed in the chat, and following Ifeoma's presentation, we'll get right to the Q&A. So Ifeoma?
Thank you so much, Bomi, and thank you to Great Building United for inviting me to be a part of this really interesting discussion. Satpal, that presentation was amazing, and I'm really glad to follow you and to be a part of this conversation with you. So I just want to start by saying that, you know, climate change is a threat to everyone's physical health, mental health, air, water, food, and shelter. But some groups, socially and economically disadvantaged ones, face the greatest risk. This is because of where they live, their health, income, language barriers, and limited access to resources. In the US, these more vulnerable communities are largely the communities of color, immigrants, low-income communities, and people for whom English is not their native language. As time goes on, they will suffer the worst impacts of climate change, and environmental justice are inextricably linked. Unless we recognize that fighting climate change and environmental justice are inextricably linked. So, as Bomi mentioned before, I'm the founding director of Creative Urban Alchemy, and my process is really centered on a very deep in-depth engagement process. First, it starts with co-defining the problem with community and really learning from their lived experience. The next step is co-designing with community, ensuring that there are interactive ways that community can be involved in the design process. And the third is, particularly as it relates to public space, co-creating public space collaboratively. And all of this in an effort to ensure that there's a sense of co-ownership between all parties involved. And I think this process can be really central to addressing the myriad facets of justice, whether it's social justice, climate justice, environmental justice, place-based justice, and they all feed into an approach to equitable urban design and spatial justice. I really appreciate this quote by Barbara Brown Wilson in her book, Resilience for All, Striving for Equity Through Community-Driven Design, where she states, as extreme climate events and other major stressors continue to raise the stakes of decision-making in urban neighborhoods, community-engaged design must become increasingly adept at asserting the value of local knowledge and at building the social spatial networks to increase adaptive capacity in vulnerable communities. So what I get from this is that there's a critical importance of the lived experience of residents in our design process to really understand what their challenges are, and then also that we can use design to build those social spatial networks. And the question is, like, what are those social spatial networks? And I also appreciate this quote from Eric Klinenberg in his book, Palaces for the People, where he describes social infrastructure as not your home, or your work, but it's that third space. It's a space where community comes together. It's your public spaces, it's your libraries, your public assets in the community. It can even be your cafes or the place where you get your hair done, but it really is the place where social bonds are formed. And when it is strong, neighborhoods flourish. When it's neglected, individuals must fend for themselves. All the more important to this notion of climate change and climate justice. So when we think about, vulnerable communities and wonder why communities are vulnerable, those challenges that come to those communities are twofold. There are the daily stressors that establish extreme levels of vulnerability, such as food insecurity, racism, crime, poverty. By the time vulnerable communities experience shocks of climate change, they aren't resilient enough to withstand the blow. And the pandemic and its impact on vulnerable communities and the way it's exposed health inequities, a prime example of that. So I want to take you through a series of case studies, work that I was involved in working for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice as a part of a team referred to as the Mayor's Action Plan for Neighborhood Safety. And I served as the Director of Strategic Design Initiatives, their first in-house design advisor for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. And we worked across 15 public housing developments in New York City. And they were labeled the developments that accounted for the highest amount of crime in New York City. And this is not to say that crime is rampant throughout New York City, but that it was really prevalent in these particular developments because they were manufactured concentration of poverty. And really as a legacy of much of what Satpal talked about in terms of the redlining, the legacy of redlining, institutional racism in the built environment that these communities have experienced. So most of the 15 public housing developments are actually located in formerly redlined communities. And that impact of redlining has also had a legacy of trauma on these communities. And they're presently experiencing overcrowded housing, high poverty rates, high unemployment. So essentially all these stressors that ensure that they will remain vulnerable. And on top of that, compounding on top of that, are also just the impacts of climate change. This map from the Mayor's Office of Resiliency indicate that many of those areas that we were working in that were high crime areas are also experiencing extreme heat vulnerability as well. And so all of these factors really have an impact on the ability for people to either enjoy their outdoor spaces or even just enjoy a quality living environment. So we felt it was important to just develop community leaders so people have capacity to transform spaces in their community, to understand how dysfunction in their community leads to dysfunctions in their built environment lead to the lived experience that they were experiencing, the trauma that they had been experiencing. So we paired them with trainers to train them and help them understand topics such as placemaking, community organizing, urban design, and community safety through environmental design. And we also use mapping as a tool to do that. And this is referred to as a heat map. We worked collaboratively with the Center for Court Innovation in each of the 15 sites. And this mapping was really a tool to help residents uncover and begin to illustrate their lived experience through mapping. And so this map is a demonstration of just some of the undesirable activity that they were experiencing on their public housing developments, from public urination to substance sale. But they were also capturing what are the pro-social activities that they were experiencing on their developments. Where are activities where young people are hanging out? Where are senior citizens hanging out? And how can they shift that pro-social activity to areas where the undesirable activity is occurring? And so this is one example. This is in Patterson Houses in the Bronx. You can see from the image above that there's a fenced-in green space. And whether it's you're dealing with climate justice, environmental justice, or just criminal justice, this is an issue to have a majority of your open spaces fenced in, particularly when public spaces, open spaces, are the communal spaces, are the places where community bonds are formed. It's the place where you connect with nature. It's the place where you come together in case of an emergency. So when they're fenced in like this, what does that say about your community? The particular resident team in Patterson Houses, they wanted to really transform this space and create a garden of peace, a place where people can address issues of mental health, issues, substance abuse, and really be a gathering place for the community. And so they were able to do just that. But not only were they able to implement this public space transformation project, this placemaking project, they were also able to partner with Citibank, Mission Continues, the Center for Coordinated Innovation, and a number of other organizations in order to develop this placemaking project. And what this does is it empowers them to be able to do more work into the future. And so this is essentially justice in action. The people in the black shirts are the residents, and the people in the blue shirts are the many organizations in their neighborhood that supported them to make this placemaking project a reality. And so now they use this placemaking project for community gatherings. They use it for Tai Chi, Zumba classes, and a myriad of other programming that really centers on community health. And then I think this initiative, this attempt at really harnessing the willpower of community to transform public spaces can also apply to the transformation of public infrastructure, developing social infrastructure, but then also through transformation of lighting. In this particular site in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is a historically African-American community, I worked as a part of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, partnered with the Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer to put forth a competition. And this competition garnered a number of different entries. And this one in particular was a partnership between the Brownsville Partnership, People Culture, and the Brownsville Justice Community Center, where they trained young people on coding. And that coding led to the transformation of public space, for them to understand how to use technology to transform their public spaces at night. So that it wasn't just about using public spaces in the day, it's also about using public spaces at night. And this can be really quite transformative for a community that's experiencing climate change and need those energy centers. They need those emergency centers. And so what resulted was this really amazing opportunity to use projections in public space as a way of animating public space and getting people excited about using this space at night and feeling safe to do that. And it also created a platform for young people to be involved in civic engagement, which is actually quite critical to this idea of justice. So I want to end with 3 key points for you. In really thinking about designing for climate justice. The first is really that we need to think about how it's co-created with community. In what ways can we co-create with community, either in defining the problem, designing the solution, or even in implementing the solution, and even in operating that solution after it's been implemented. The second is that it should be focused on equity and justice. As we're thinking about all the hardships and traumas that have been inflicted upon vulnerable communities, we really need to center equity and justice in any approach that we do for really thinking about addressing these shocks and stressors that these communities are impacted by on a daily basis. And the third is moving at the speed of trust. Trust and the way in which it is built is not a swift process. It takes time, and really we should move at the speed at which people trust the process and participate in the process and trust that the outcome of the process will benefit them. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ifeoma. So while, again, I'll encourage folks to put any questions they may want to pose in the chat window. I'd like to get us started off by asking each of you to sort of, again, think back to the keynote address last night, and what does it mean for you individually as a practitioner to be working towards Dr. King's beloved community? How do you live that ideal as your work and through your work? Ifeoma, do you want to go first, and then Satpal?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I really love this question, and it had me thinking about, what exactly is Dr. King's beloved community? And, King, he envisioned a society based on justice, equal opportunity, a love for one's fellow human beings. And that is really, I think, if you're thinking about public spaces, you're thinking about communal spaces and a place where people come together, that this is like the perfect opportunity to really demonstrate Dr. King's beloved community. And I think the work that I do, that I really promote and encourage and advocate for, is really thinking about how you can instill a community of care and an ethic of care in the transformation of open spaces and transformation of urban spaces. And that's not only in just like the final product, but also in the process. How can you encourage people to care for one another differently, care for the space differently? And it's amazing the kind of cohesion and igniting that can do through a process that really centers care and justice at the heart of it.
Yeah, I mean, if I might just have a follow-up comment to that, Ifeoma. I mean, when I hear you say ethic of care, I mean, to me, I think that's a really powerful phrase, and to me, that evokes this idea that that we're building the buildings and the community and the developments that we would build for people we love, rather than asking sort of what do we have to build. Is that sort of what you mean by this ethic of care?
Absolutely. And I think, in addition to that, we're also thinking about the futures that we seek. I think as practitioners in the built environment, we're not designing for today, we're designing for the future. And then if we think about what Satpal presented in terms of redlining, someone envisioned a future where there wasn't harmony, where there wasn't care, right? If you thought to put together a redlining plan and all the nuances behind it, you didn't envision a future where there was care towards each other. And so as built environment practitioners, it's important for us to really think about the future and how we're going to operate differently. And so the ways in which people care for one another, we can do that through design. We can create designed environments where people are like thinking about each other, they're interacting with each other differently. And I think that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, Satpal, can I invite you to jump in?
Sure. I really love Ifeoma's answer. I feel like I have not as it doesn't seem as deep sometimes. But I love the question that was posed, just generally because this idea of having a beloved community and what does it mean, and I thought about it a lot actually, and I think one of the things it translates to me personally, and even in my practice, is this idea of seva, which as a Sikh being grown up in the UK, is a concept we have called selfless service. And it was ingrained in me since a child. And it's something you do for the betterment of everyone, not expecting any results. It's a huge, basically, task to live up to. But it's one golden service that I personally try to have as a rule in my own practice and my life, that if I don't want to be treated a certain way, why should someone else? If it's the very act of kindness that will help someone get there, I rather do it. And I think sometimes we forget this. And even for me to be an immigrant in this country, coming with no family, by default, when you start designing for these communities, they become your family for temporary space. You're inheriting that space. You're trying to have the empathy where it goes into, you're trying to form that connection. And I think good design and just generally people being kindness will win everything. And I do believe in that totally. But I think sometimes we forget that because humanity gets the worst of us sometimes. But I feel still that, the fact going back to community is what we all strive towards to go to and be part of, even if you're oceans apart from other people.
Yeah. And Ifeoma, just, you and I are trained planners in a tradition that asks us to value the agency of non-experts. And I wanted to ask you, you spoke a lot about sort of process, community engagement and the importance of co-creating. And I wanted to ask you, do you see, is there a basic tension at work in affordable housing, sort of at the level of governance?
I mean, first of all, the notion that people are non-experts, in a way, I disagree with that. I think it depends. Yeah, what kind of expertise in what? I think we're all experts in something, and there's an expertise in a lived experience, and I can't bring that to any process. And therefore, especially when you're thinking about designing affordable housing, or developing affordable housing, it's essentially it's a vertical community. It's no different than designing horizontally, and therefore there's still a lived experience that's important to understand and incorporate, and to just like tease out through a process. And so I think as in respect to affordable housing, it's really critical to get that lived experience. Because it's very unique to each neighborhood. Affordable housing you can't just have this boilerplate approach to developing affordable housing across the city. You need to really think about how it's unique to its context, particularly if it's mixed use. Like, what are you putting on the ground floor? Like, you really have to create it as if it's a resource for that neighborhood, while it's also a resource for the city. And so, I return to just the fact that like the expertise of the people that are living there is important to that process of crafting strategies for affordable housing.
Yeah, and I want to ask, just because this is such a thematically related question, I want to invite Samina to come on and ask your question, if you would.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I wanted to get into the kind of tactics of really, engaging the community. Like, what are some best practices for really, are there forums? Are there invited, publicized community events? Are there surveys? How do you engage different age levels? Oftentimes, the people who will come to these things are kind of self-selected, people who might be interested or have something to complain about, or, and then there's a lot of maybe missing voices that you're not hearing, like the younger people or the older people or the disabled population. And I think also, I did a survey back when I had just graduated from Columbia of garbage shop owners, opinions on 125th Street. This was in conjunction with the 125th Street bid, business improvement district, about the garbage that was on 125th Street. And we didn't get a great survey result or return, because there was kind of like a distrust of like, is anything going to happen, and is anything going to solve my problem? You know what I mean? So like, I'm just interested to hear like what processes you found most successful, maybe like specific examples, and what didn't work so well.
Yeah, I invite either one of you to start.
I can certainly start. I think that's a really brilliant question, and I think it really depends on, there's so many factors. I think it depends on the community, it depends on the project type, it depends on are you working as a representative from government, private sector, nonprofit sector. Each of them requires, I think, a different approach, and I think each of them has a different capacity to implement certain aspects of it. So, for myself in government, we do a lot of like workshops, and we do, engage elected officials, and, so that the government has a certain approach. And I think I've also worked in nonprofit doing engagement, and that might allow for a bit more deeper engagement, actually like meeting people where they are, you're going to events, you're talking to people on the street. Like there's a different level of engagement that can happen there. There's a different capacity level for engagement that can happen there. I think for public space projects, you might want to be more engaged and create opportunities for people to create on their own, which is some of the ideas that I've showed you. But then when you get to like a housing scale, it's different. It's more about interactive workshops that allow people to provide insight and feedback on this. So, I think there needs to be flexibility in the approaches to engagement, depending on the scale, and especially also just like what role you're playing in that work. But what I have seen that has not worked, that I think has also just like really create a lot of agitation, is coming in with preconceived notions, coming in with this like already planned out, designed everything, and you're just like showing people what has already been done, that has already been crafted, and you're just like, okay, give me some feedback on what has already, this per theme completed design. And so that doesn't work. That's not engagement at all. And so I think that can have very disastrous effects and really have an impact on the level of trust in the process.
Yeah, I totally agree with Ifeoma there. And I think one of the examples, like it's a recent example that comes to my mind, it's actually based in India, not based on 125th Street, which I live very close to, but it's when the farmers were protesting in India, they're still protesting, but they actually had this series of nails placed in so they wouldn't enter Delhi itself. So what they ended up doing is they started using the things around them as plantings instead. So the language itself started to change. So I think the kind of thing is like, I would mostly try to like push people towards is don't have that preconceived notion of what do you think A and B is going to do. Be open towards what they might be suggesting instead, because winning someone's trust is definitely not going to happen overnight, because I think they've gone through this process. The area itself has transformed over many times. People are coming in and out. And I think it kind of means could you provide them with the tools that they feel they have the power and some means instead, rather than switching it around and say, these are the things that you should be doing instead. And I think that's the really like big thing that I see sometimes missing in these communities, because a lot of the interjections we get in them is really based by our own opinions. We're not really asking them, what have you seen to be successful? What is the things over time that have worked? What was happening there before? And I think that's really important to understand as you start placing what's leading for people to also do that movement. Because if they want the streets to be clean, if rubbish is there, does it just mean it's just a responsibility of the shop owners? Do we need to get other city people involved? And I think that's where it gets a little bit deeper. It's just not simple as there is. So that's just from my own experience.
I'd like to invite Tim to come on and ask your question, Tim.
Sure. Yeah, it's less of a question than a struggle I'm having, because everything that both of you are talking about is how I have been educated and to understand what it means to design and build responsible communities. And so I feel again like there's some blind spot I must be missing, because it's one thing because we always, in designing affordable housing, we're always talking about engagement with the community. Sometimes that's elusive because number one, you don't know who's moving into these buildings. It's veteran housing, for instance. It's senior housing, for instance. You don't know the community. Developers, as an architect, if you're working with a developer that will be building that community after the project's built, who do you engage with? So I'm struggling with how this kind of explicit knowledge around the relationship between climate change, climate justice, and racial justice literally affects the way I design. Like specifically, I don't know if I don't know if each of you can speak to that, and specifically within the world of passive house activity, because it's got, as I said on the opening, I think, you know, it's implicit. It's been implicit for me all along, but I'm having real trouble finding what it is that I am not seeing about how I design and build communities for people. So I don't know if you've struggled with that. Yeah.
I have a comment, but I want to invite Ifeoma and Satpal to comment first.
I guess my question to Tim would be, so I always, and this is not me being tricky, so how do you think you are designing? So maybe some of it goes back to the very thing that you think is implicit is not actually implicit. Like what you're designing is still based on a preconceived notion, right? And I think that's where, like even in a passive house environment where you may not know who your client is and you're just designing, think it's going to be a veteran or whatever, but you know, for example, your energy bills are going to be so much, you already have a notion how your building is going to look. So you're almost starting with that first, right? So you already have these layouts of these units. You already have an image, how something that your developer would like, and therefore you would like, and therefore the user would like, right? But we're not necessarily going into that element of, is whoever my end user is, could I know anything more about it that I need to adjust as part of this design? Is there something missing in that? Because we're so used to performing on guidelines or principles or protocols, I think we're not really doing that pause and saying, okay, I've done all this. Is there something still missing in that design? And I think for me, even as a person who's been doing high performance buildings, I began to see personally was a critique of my own work, where I didn't feel I was asking the questions anymore. I was in autopilot. And I should be asking these questions because these are the very questions of the communities, whether it might be a wide range of people, but I needed to know myself, who were these people? And I think that kind of led, that deconstruction at least has helped me to answer some of the things I'm looking for. I'm not saying you can have all the answers overnight, but it really helps to kind of bring the implicitness of passive house, what it does as a formula to what it really means to who you want and what you want to be doing as an actual design process. So I guess it becomes more designy in that way.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. I think I also want to add to that, you know, a building has edges and it has an impact on the street and it has impact on the surrounding, you know, the uses across the street, et cetera, and so forth. So your users are not only the people that live in that building, they are also the community that pass that building on a daily basis. They're the business across the street that are impacted by that building as well. And so your users are the veterans in the building, but they're also the people in the community that, you know, interact with that building in the day and the night. And so I think it's also just shifting your thinking around who the user is and also what the impact of that building is, not only interior, but also just like the exterior impact of that building.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I might take moderator's privilege and just add one other comment, Tim. I mean, you know, this is a little bit speaking to the choir, preaching to the choir, but you know, when you go back to this idea that Ifeoma presented about, you know, having this ethic of care, right? So if you think about like, you know, how, for example, healthcare, right? You know, you don't need to, like doctors, you know, look at the outcomes that result from actions and could put in rules. So for example, once they figured out that they really needed to wash hands, they could put up their, you know, their checklist to wash hands and what have you. And they did that. They didn't have to then go and consult the client base to be like, would you like for me to wash hands? And so I think that to some extent with Passive House, to me, this is a really powerful argument for why Passive House ought to be the standard, because we know what the outcomes are, right? And you know, there's a preponderance of evidence that says that we can make evidence-based decisions around building performance in this particular way. And so to me, this is a really powerful argument to say, this, you know, so all new buildings Passive House, right? So that's, and then the second comment I wanted to offer is, you know, we don't work in this way because we're short-sighted people. We didn't come into this industry because we thought, this was a fun, easy way to make money, right? And so I think that there's a process by which, and I've taken a step back from this industry a little bit, so, you can throw eggs at me if you like, but, there's a process by which we've all kind of become very used to the difficulty of getting anything done. And so I think that when you say, well, I am a thoughtful designer and I'm trying to do these things, yet, I don't know how to go that, last mile, or I don't know how to do better than I'm doing. To me, that sort of says, well, let's take a step back and be like, well, what do we need to change in this landscape in order for us to all do better, right? Is it a matter of who owns the land, right? So there's lots of different ways of talking about power. So is it a governance issue over who ultimately makes the development decisions, as opposed to who's consulted about the design,
Right. Yeah, great comments. That last one is much more kind of holistic reordering of power and capital and decision making. That I can latch on to. I'm a fan of such big moves and big rethinking. And Satpal, your comment around the questions I'm not asking. That's exactly the blind spot that I'm excited about now. Thinking through. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for maybe like one more question. Can I'd like to invite Anna Brown to come on screen and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And really appreciate this group, first of all, and Fomi and Ifeoma. Satpal, I don't know you, but it's been really wonderful hearing your remarks, and I appreciate very much the reflective sort of the discussion, including from some of the other participants. I had a question that maybe is a little, I guess it's sort of big and broad, but sort of trying to drive toward tactical in a way, which is sort of reflecting on, I think, a lot of the ways in which programming and design is undertaken as kind of, at least in the world that I come from, which is a little bit less housing specific, is sort of like there's sort of ideas about solutions or outcomes that are desired that are very sort of supply side, to use, I guess, one way of thinking about it. And I guess I would really appreciate any thoughts or reflections on where you see ways to really sort of create a bigger space and sort of more toward like a norms shifting, frankly, around, I mean, I think there's lots of great examples of community-led design, decision-making, co-design and process, but I'm curious if you see openings to sort of wedge that out more towards sort of normalizing that as a practice, as those are outcomes that are important in terms, not only how many water spigots or how many housing units or how much greenhouse gas emissions reduced, but like that the sort of beloved community aspects, or how to sort of do placemaking and sort of make those outcomes sort of on par, I guess, with some of the other things. So yeah, I welcome any thoughts or reflections from y'all.
I think you bring up a really great point, and I think it's an aspiration for sure. I'm seeing community design centers, neighborhood design centers, more and more of them popping up around the country even, and with a different approach to working on projects, whether it's an architectural project or a community design or even a placemaking project. So there is this, growing and shifting movement, I think, in both architecture and planning field, I think, where they intersect. And there are institutions that are being created just to do just that work. Now, whether that shifts into governance and whether that shifts into the way government works is another story. It's, there's so much involved, there's so much bureaucracy involved, and, legislation and regulations that it just makes it very difficult, and the level of capacity to do things in that way also difficult. I don't know, Satpal, Bomi, if you also want to add to that.
Just going to say it is broad, and I think to Ifeoma's point, I think as these community design engagements, they open up and they continue to open up, and the dialogue begins to shift. I think we're in this experimental place right now, personally. I feel we're asking the questions, and it's okay for us not to know the answers, because we're not going to. And I think in this process, what we are going to see is different levels of results at different places. And I think that's maybe is just a part of this, where you might be the person who might have a solution to it for your area, and it kind of like, leads on to other areas where I don't think it's going to be I think it's going to be equally as Passive House first started. It was almost perceived at that time this could not even happen, but yet the dialogue changed. And then I personally feel this dialogue that we're having today, this dialogue will change as well. We'll be sitting here hopefully in a few years' time, and this, we'll be just already be incorporating different ways of looking at this. It won't be already about details, but it will be about the community aspect. And I think that's where it's going to be. Every experiment's going to be different. Sorry, I know it's very broad, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, no, I love that it's this future-looking vision, though. I think it's a great place to wrap it up for this session. I want to thank both of you, Satpal and Ifeoma. I'd like to thank all of the folks who joined us for this chat today, as well as Green Building United for the opportunity to have this conversation. And I'd like to hand it back to, I guess, Pat.
Yes, I think we are going to go back into the main room and go to our next session activity.
Yeah, we'll see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And everyone.
Thank you.